Afternoon from India, good evening to Professor Wilson in New Zealand, and good morning to Dr. Shah and Professor Tierstoffer in Europe. Welcome to this international and interdisciplinary webinar, which has been organized by the CoHaB Indian Diaspora Center with our two collaborators, the Department of Law from the University of Mumbai and the Law and Literature.
Can you hear it, Kevin?
Of the University of Muenster. I welcome you all to this webinar, and I hand over to Professor Rajeshri Varadi, Head Department of Law, University of Mumbai, to formally welcome all of you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome all of you special dignitaries who are there in this program, which is organized by CoHaB Center and Department of Law, University of Mumbai and WW University of Muenster, Germany. We have organized series of program, and this is one more program which is going to take place today on the topic of interdisciplinary international law, literature and diaspora lecture series. Hearty welcome to our dignitaries and other participants at international level from New Zealand, London, Europe. I'm very happy to see all of you here. I just wish to say a few words about our Department of Law. Department of Law is established in 1958, and we are running here 6 postgraduate degree courses on the topic of human rights, environmental law, business law, intellectual property rights, criminal law, and constitutional law. And we give opportunity to all students equally here. And we are just charging a fees of 5,000 rupees per year for giving postgraduate degree. I think I feel very proud about it that at international level, our university is the one who is offering postgraduate courses at such a cheapest fees are there, so that even a person from grassroots level can come to the university, take benefit, take legal education from our university, which we are imparting. And especially that is why when Dr. Nilofer Madam has started this research, and Tierstoffer also taken this initiative to organize this diaspora lecture series, we happily join our hands with them. We have presently 600 students for the postgraduate department of law, and for PhD degree also fees are same 5,000 rupees yearly fees we are charging. We are running MPhil in law courses. I am just saying it because my other university people are there. I am very happy that there is a professor from University of Northampton, UK, and one professor is from Queen's Mary University, London. So it is a great pleasure in welcoming each one of you specially. My hearty welcome to Dr. Prakash Shah from Queen's Mary University of London, who will give his remarks on the theme of our this conference today, on which our lectures series are organized. My hearty welcome also is to Professor Janet Wilson from University of Northampton, UK. Madam, we are very happy to have you here, and we are grateful to you for agreeing to join us and deliver lecture today on the special topic which we have chosen here for this conference. My special welcome to Professor Klaus Tierstoffer, who guides us in organizing this lecture series, and continuously he is with us, and he is the person who has taken initiative with Dr. Nilofer Bharucha to start this lecture series and this project. Slowly, we are moving ahead, and in full year, I think we will come out with best of results of this research project. My special welcome to my most dear friend, Dr. Nilofer Bharucha, who is going to address us today on the topic of laws and the Indian diaspora, reflection in Jahaji to jet setter literature. Nilofer madam, I really appreciate your all efforts in organizing all this. I also welcome sweet our friend Miss Kirti, who always uh, takes initiative in doing all kind of coordination, preparing invitation, and reminding us about our programs. Thank you, Kirti. I really appreciate your work here. I also welcome our all participants at international level and national level who have joined this program. Thank you very much, and hearty welcome from the Department of Law, University of Mumbai, my both professors from London. You are welcome here anytime. If you wish to interact with our students, we can organize your special lectures for students. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Yes, Kirti.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Varadi, for your welcome. Thank you. Thank you. I would now like to introduce Professor Klaus Tierstoffer. Although most of us here know him, there are quite a few in the participants who may not know him. So Professor Tierstoffer, please allow me to introduce you before I hand over the meeting to you as chair. Uh, Klaus Tierstoffer studied theology and English at the University of Regensburg, Germany, interrupted by a year as visiting student at Keble College, Oxford. He then went on to work for his DPhil at the University of Oxford, had a stint of teacher training in Bavaria, and then another 2 years as a research fellow in Oxford before he started on his postdoctoral thesis at the University of Würzburg, Germany. His first professorship was in Dusseldorf, from where he went to take up his current position as chair of British Studies at the University of Muenster in 2004. He has served as vice president and president of the German Association for the Study of English and has held several fellowships, among them the Christensen Fellowship at St. Catherine's College, Oxford. He is a corresponding fellow of the English Association in the UK. He has published widely on English literary history and on the theory of literature. He was coordinator of the Marie Curie project Diasporic Constructions of Home and Belonging, in which the University of Mumbai was also a partner, and director of the graduate training program on literary form in Muenster. He is currently spokesperson of the Collaborative Research Center 1385 Law and Literature in Muenster, which is funded by the German Research Council. His current research is on models in literature and on equity in Victorian writing. Thank you, Professor Klaus, for agreeing to chair our webinar today. And I hand over the platform to you, sir.
Thank you, Kirti, for this warm welcome. Thank you, Professor Varadi. A warm welcome to everyone here, especially I just see Feroz Navroji has come on screen. A very warm welcome to Africa. We miss a little bit of your nice warm climate here in Frankfurt, which is very cold just now. So thank you for joining. Thank you everyone for joining. As you can see, we have only 19 participants today at the moment. This is a smaller rollout as we usually had in these lectures, mainly because I understand that students in India are very busy at the moment, but also because I have not been very efficient in distributing the call as usual to our friends in Western Africa and actually in Germany, because we found it's actually easier to distribute our lectures to them when it's recorded. We always have them on YouTube, and they have problems with logging into Zoom. So this is perhaps the reason we will have the kind of reach we usually have, just with other means and methods this time. Maybe I can say just a few words about the background of our network, which of course Kirti has started to talk about. For those who have recently joined in this webinar series, the background is a Marie Curie program on diasporic constructions of home and belonging, way back from 2011 to 2015, in which Muenster, Mumbai, but also Northampton, Janet Wilson represents it here as our esteemed partner from the time being, worked together on many aspects of diaspora, but also even then we had legal aspects in the diaspora studies. And I had the pleasure of editing a diaspora studies reader with Janet later on with Routledge. So this is perhaps the origin of this collaboration we're sitting in now. I remember we had a memorable summer school in Northampton. It may have been, Janet, in 2012, something like that. And we found that Dr. Prakash Shah, who is joining us today in this webinar, actually was already a speaker at this Northampton summer school. It was called summer school. It was in March and we were snowed in. This is what I also remember about it, quite an event. So this is one aspect, and this CoHaB system, this CoHaB network has evolved, of course, thanks to our Mumbai partner, mainly represented by Professor Barucha, long-standing partner here, and I'm very grateful that this has kept up and that we have now been able to expand it to a law and literature perspective. Many thanks to the law department in Mumbai to help us expand our horizons here. On the German side, this is buttressed and underwritten by the Collaborative Research Center on Law and Literature, of which I'm spokesperson, which is funded with 10 million euros for 4 years until 2023. And we hope for a further extension where we will be looking at globalization as a special focus. So this has also great strategic importance for us in Muenster, but the greatest importance I see here is to build this kind of network. We've also submitted another EU proposal on diaspora studies, which we'll hear about in February next year, and where Mumbai is again a partner. So we hope to build this network and to expand it and tighten it as best we can. So this is perhaps the institutional and strategic background, which is very important to us to this webinar. It builds our network. And of course, it builds insight every time we have one of these very interesting and multifaceted presentations which we get. And this time we think about and we consider diaspora and international laws, reflections in society and culture. And this is, of course, perhaps the main point of this webinar, to show how law and literature and culture are closely interconnected and how they can actually be productively brought into contact with each other. This goes back to Aristotle, as has been widely researched. Aristotle's Poetics are very close to what he says about his legal ideas in his rhetoric and in his Nicomachean Ethics. And ever since, the correlations and correspondence between law and literature and culture has been going on, sometimes with greater scholarly focus and awareness, sometimes, as it were, subterraneously. We bring it out to the open again with this very special idea of looking at it from a global international perspective, which perhaps on the flip side always means to have a close look at the local side of it. You know, the flip side of global must always be a focus on the local. I think it was Anne Park here in Hong Kong who coined the phrase "glocal," and perhaps that is what we're doing with this webinar. So let me extend a very warm welcome to our three speakers, and I think I will introduce them. That's the idea. I will introduce them consecutively in the order they speak, and we will then have a roundup discussion at the end. So let me welcome first Dr. Prakash Shah, who specializes in cultural diversity and law, religion and law, caste and law, immigration, refugee and nationality law, and comparative law. He has published widely and lectured internationally in these fields. Dr. Shah joined Queen Mary University of London in 2002, where he is now a reader in culture and law. His academic activities include, he is a member of the Arts and Humanities Board in the UK. He's a referee for various British and European grant-making bodies. He sits on the editorial advisory board of the Asian Journal of Law and Society, International Journal of Discrimination and Law, Electronic Journal of Islamic and Middle Eastern Law, and quite a number of other publication ventures. And he is editor of the book series Cultural Diversity and Law with Routledge, which I want to draw your notice to. He's the moderator, this is perhaps also interesting, of email groups, a very digital thing, a very digital aspect to his activities here. The plurilegal concerned with accommodation by European legal systems of ethnic, religious, and diasporic minorities, and migration law, which is part of the Migration and Law Network, which supports teaching and academic work on migration law. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Prakash Shah. You will be speaking, giving us an input talk on the crisis of culture and its resolution. And let me just refer back to Kirti and Professor Barucha. We take all the three statements in a row and then only have the discussion. Is that correct? Okay, so the floor is yours, Prakash. Looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Klaus, Niluferji, for the invitation, and very nice to make your acquaintance, Rajeshri. And thanks for all your help in the run-up to this seminar, Kirti. Well, as you can see, my title is somewhat, you could read it in a very bombastic way, which kind of implies that I'm making some very big claims, and I have the solution to one of the world's largest problems of, I don't know, culture and culture conflict, and as the title indicates, the crisis of culture. But actually my aim is much more modest. I'm not here with some kind of brilliant solution to a major psychological problem of the world. But perhaps by way of background, I should say a few words how I stumbled across this topic, which I'm currently working on, and which should constitute a sort of significant portion of a book that I'm working on writing right now. And the problem is basically as follows. So what is culture? I think rather than saying there is a crisis of culture, I think the basic question is, what is culture? But then immediately in trying to find an answer to that question, we do fall into a crisis. So that's the problem of crisis. So the point is that if you look at the scholarly literature across many disciplines, one of the things that you'll find is that the notion of culture is very badly theorized, right? And most of the time, people are simply providing their own definitions of what culture is. But when you go around looking for a good theorization of culture so that you can, approach it from a more scientific standpoint, you'll find it quite difficult. Of course, you have this in-between points where you have some kind of theorization, but it tends to be difficult to treat it as a proper theorization because you can't really test the hypotheses that the individuals are putting forward, or the theories break down because you realize that they don't really have empirical consequences beyond the immediate concerns of the person putting them forward. So you have all kinds of problems. Now, to concretize the discussion a little bit, I'll say something about how I sort of try to explore the problem of culture in different disciplines, not all disciplines, but some of the key points. And of course, because I'm coming from a legal background, I started with law, and I was curious about how the legal literature is treating the conception of culture, right? Do they have a conception? Do they have some kind of solid theorization of culture? So one of the areas that I started off with was comparative law, because comparative law, it involves a comparison of different legal systems. And if you look at the contemporary literature on comparative law, it's actually become extremely wide in focus, in the sense that they no longer just do this sort of classic, comparison and contrast between civil and common law systems, but they are taking into account all kinds of different legal systems around the world, right? And trying to bring it all together in a common discussion. So the field is very fascinating. But once you go into the conceptualization of culture, you realize that they basically become weak-kneed, in the sense that they want to stand away from committing to any particular conception of culture. And that is very surprising because, if you would just guess as somebody who is not familiar with the discipline, you might say, well, to comparative lawyers, among all the different legal sub-disciplines, you might think should be primarily concerned in culture, because some of the problems that they're dealing with are surely to do with cultural differences, right? And legal systems and legal ideas and so on. Surely they must be conditioned by the culture in which they're created. And so to compare legal systems, you'd have to have some kind of reference back to cultural differences. But when you go into the literature, you find that actually they don't, and as I said, they stand away from it. And one of the classic moves that they make, which is not unique to just comparative lawyers, is that they refer back to the anthropologists, which also becomes a problem. So rather than saying that, oh, here is a kind of, conception of culture that the lawyers have developed, or we as lawyers have developed to help us in figuring out what comparative law is all about, they look to the anthropologists. But then you notice that they absolve themselves of responsibility for dealing with culture by saying that, well, actually, if you look at the anthropologists, they seem to be telling us that they have no consensus about what this thing called culture is, right? So you can't blame the lawyers for not having it. And so that becomes a way of avoiding to deal with the question. And so if you look at matters from the standpoint of culture and cultural differences, one of the things you notice about the comparative law discipline is that you'll find a certain level of theoretical poverty. Now, if you look across at other legal disciplines or legal sub-disciplines, like the one I'm primarily concerned with, which is cultural diversity and law, and that's of course a motley collection of different sort of types of writing, you know, from anthropology of law, legal pluralism, all kinds of different things come into it. You also find a similar kind of problem, right? You notice that there is a tendency to defer to the works of anthropologists, and there isn't a critique available of the anthropological work which connects to culture. Now, of course, it's not surprising in a way, right? Like that all these different legal groups are saying that we should look at the anthropologists. Why is that? Because, you know, if you look at all the different social sciences that have been developed in the Western world so far, if you're going to ask the question, who are the specialists in culture, the study of culture? The answer seems quite obvious. Yeah, it should be the anthropologists, right? Not really the sociologists or the psychologists, but, you know, it's the anthropologists who are regarded as the specialists in the study of culture. But then what happens if we take this suggestion seriously and actually do look at what the anthropologists have done? One of the things you find is that there is a section of anthropologists, or a segment among them, who have almost given up trying to theorize culture, right? They've said, well, you know, arriving at a definition creates so many problems because it can't solve problems of social justice. It might become too essentialistic. It becomes too reified. You know, all these kind of motley collection of problems are coming up in the anthropological literature. So, in fact, one of my colleagues, Elena Rugiu from Sardinia, she's a kind of specialist in the study of law and culture as well. She works a lot on how culture comes into the courtroom of different European countries, not just European, actually Western countries, and how the judges have to deal with cultural differences and so on. And she says very pointedly, I think very interestingly, she says that actually among the anthropologists, you find that there is a kind of nihilism about culture, right? In the sense that they seem to have also themselves kind of given up on trying to find some kind of decent theorization of it. However, that doesn't mean that, you know, all anthropologists have gone that way. And in fact, one of the dominant themes you find in the theorization of culture, which has spread across many different disciplines, in fact, is that they will tend to say that, well, culture is something to do with the beliefs of a people, and it's about the norms of a people, and culture gives people some kind of meaning to what they're doing, right? So it's about beliefs, norms, and meaning. And of course, many of us would not find that troubling. Say, well, that's actually a kind of, you know, sounds like a common sense idea. Of course, I don't see myself. And it's about creating meaning, right? And you might go further and say, well, it gives, you know, people, by creating meaning, it gives a kind of purpose to their lives and so on. Of course, it's not an individual thing, because it's not just about individual psychology, but it's a group thing, right? So it's to do with a group of people rather than just a collection of individuals. So there's some kind of common element to it. But basically, it's about those kind of 3 or 4 components, right? Fine, that's fine, right? But there is a kind of lurking problem there, right? If we say that basically the anthropologists, what they are doing is using our common sense idea of culture and saying, well, you know, because, I mean, it seems obvious almost. They don't explain why culture is about beliefs and norms and meaning. They don't explain why. So actually what happens is that it comes out as a kind of presupposition in their work, right? That if we talk about culture, it must be something to do with beliefs, norms, and meaning, right? So if it's a presupposition, it kind of invites curiosity about, well, where is that presupposition coming from? And I'm going to argue actually that that presupposition comes from within a particular culture, which is the Western culture, which is really the kind of the creator of the discipline of anthropology as it is of social sciences in general. So what you have actually is not some kind of scientific theory of culture, but one culture's intuitive framework at play in arriving at this particular idea of culture, right? And it's very widespread. And of course, those people who don't take time to problematize the assumption will generally carry on with this, carry on adopting and simply projecting this idea that this is what culture is about, right? And it's actually, I would urge anybody who's interested in it just to have a look at the sampling of literature within social sciences in any discipline. And you'll probably find an echo of this somewhere, yeah, or more or less everywhere, right? Now, just as a quick aside, I also had a look at the literature on multiculturalism, right? Because I'm interested in cultural diversity. And what happens to immigrants and their descendants, particularly in Western countries like Britain. How do they interact with legal systems and all kinds of problems that produces. So multiculturalism is actually one of the core areas that I'm interested in. And so one question is, well, how do the multiculturalists deal with the question of culture? And one of the interesting things I realized is that there's a section of multiculturalists who do talk, they do talk about culture. And there's a section which actually doesn't really want to talk about culture, right? Which is strange, because if you look at the label that they've given themselves, like multiculturalists, you'd think that, well, surely multiculturalism is something to do with culture. Maybe cultural differences, because it's multi, right? But then you realize that, well, that segment actually is not really that interested in. So as an example of the first, the classic proponent of multiculturalism, liberal proponent of multiculturalism is Will Kymlicka, right? He started writing in the 1980s and came up with a quite influential kind of justification for multiculturalism. Now, of course, he's been criticized by both liberal and non-liberal writers since that time and so on. But in terms of making a big push in the theoretical literature in political science and adjacent fields, Will Kymlicka was one of the kind of pioneers, right, who was pushing for this idea of multiculturalism. If you look at his take on what culture is, I mean, he just basically has a shopping list, which includes things like language, history, and of course, he doesn't want all kinds of cultures to have rights, right? Or all kinds of people to have cultural rights. So he says, well, actually, you also need to have some kind of set of institutions, right, through which these cultural ideas are promoted. So it's not any old culture. So, for example, he says that immigrant people don't have a right to culture, but only those with societal culture have a right to culture, right? So he kind of qualifies his idea of culture by adding this kind of adjective to it, saying, well, it has to be societal culture. That's not my immediate problem, right? Of course, there is a problem, and that's been picked up by a lot of people like Biko Parek or Tariq Modud, who came on to kind of criticize the dominant theories of multiculturalism up to then, which is like Kymlicka especially. So the deeper problem is for me right now is the conceptualization of culture. So in a way, you see, I've been saying that there is a kind of Western culture and the conceptualization of culture, the dominant conceptualization of culture we have actually refers back to the intuition, the ground intuitions of the Western culture. I think Kymlicka's is also a kind of reflection of that. right? Because, for example, if you look at the kind of conflicts that he's concerned with, of course, his main model is in Canada, right? So you can see why he's developed his conception of multiculturalism around the kind of problems that Canada initially was experiencing, right? And it's not surprising. That's why that one of the ingredients that he has for culture is language, right? And also history, right? So whereas if you look at language and language differences, I mean, you might say that language is an important part of culture, but actually, look at a place like India, right? If you look at India before the colonial period, you will not find, I don't think, I mean, I'm happy to be corrected, or certainly in any widespread way, you will not find conflicts to do with languages, and people were quite easygoing, and they still are, I think, in India, about learning multiple languages and so on, right? Of course, as a result of European colonization, there has been some conflicts to do with language, but I think they're derivative of a kind of European problem, which Indians have sort of just adopted today. And you can say that across Asia, actually, right? That Asians, within Asian culture, there is a kind of relative tendency not to problematize language, right? And to create conflicts on the ground of language. So Kimlika's thing, you can say, well, actually, that seems to be more suited to the fight that European nationalisms have had, which has been partly about language, right, and linguistic rights and so on, rather than a kind of globally applicable definition. It seems quite, some people might say it's too Eurocentric or Western-centered and so on. So you have, you immediately run into problems if you want to claim that Kimlika's is some kind of broadly applicable theory of culture. Of course, he also has an attachment to liberalism, right, because he wants to say that not all cultures have people have cultural rights, because if they deny individual autonomy, then they shouldn't have the right to culture. Well, okay, individual autonomy is something that is important to liberalism, but it's not important to all kinds of theories, and it's also not important to everybody in the world, right? So it becomes a very kind of restricted. His idea of culture and cultural rights seems to be quite restricted to one particular culture's experience of the world. And conception of what human beings are about. So, and you can move on. I mean, you could talk about, there is a very, I found her quite intriguing, Anne Phillips from the London School of Economics. She has a book called Multiculturalism Without Culture. So you might say, well, she's one of the honest people because, among the multiculturalists, because she's saying, well, I do want multiculturalism, but I'm not really interested in the culture part. If I want to abandon the culture part. Well, actually, if you read her book, that's not what she says, right? She says that, like many of the anthropologists have been also saying, right, that the conception of culture itself is problematic because, it sort of essentializes and reifies people's experiences and, and so on and so forth. So she, in a way, adopts the kind of problems that other theorists from other disciplines have been talking about. But then she also has some weird statements in the book, like, that differences among people are not really that significant, right? So you end up getting the feeling that she's actually not really that interested in cultural differences per se, right? And if you look at her definitions of culture within the book, you realize that actually she's also following the mainline ideas. She's also saying that culture is about beliefs and norms and giving meaning and so on. So there's nothing unusual about what she's saying, except that she creates this kind of buzz by saying that, well, I want to have a multiculturalism which is about culture, which she doesn't live up to in the book anyway. In fact, she explicitly admits that that's not what she wants to say, but she chose a kind of snazzy title about it. Tariq Maudud is one of the prominent sort of writers on multiculturalism. He has several books on the issue. Another British writer. You look at his work as well. I mean, of course, he's interested in, how identity politics functions, and he thinks that the British model of multiculturalism is very good in that it sort of allows a relatively flexible environment in which identity politics can be played out, also within the legal system. But he explicitly says that one of his primary concerns is not to deal with culture, right? And certainly not to theorize it. So again, you get this kind of very odd situation where you have a proponent of multiculturalism who's not interested in culture, right? Of course, he's interested in a motley collection of differences, right? Like race, religion, ethnicity, and so on. But he doesn't really deal with culture. So you don't get a good theorization of culture at all from looking at Tariq Maudud's work. One of the people whom Tariq Maudud inspired, however, is, who inspired Tariq Maudud is Bhikhu Parekh, who's sort of famous political philosopher of multiculturalism in Britain. He's also part of a House of Lords in England, in Britain, sorry. And among the writers of multiculturalism, and in particular among the non-liberal writers, the critics of multiculturalism, as well as somebody who builds his own idea of multiculturalism, Parekh is quite interesting in the sense that he does try to build his own idea of culture. And he has if you look at his book Rethinking Multiculturalism, he has an extensive discussion on what culture is and why it's important to people, and why it deserves respect and so on. So he has a very kind of strong justification, right, for saying that culture is something, it is important. And he also tries to figure out if it is important, well, what is it then? What is culture, right? But again, if you look at how he describes culture, in fact, he follows the dominant position, right, which I say is a kind of Western position, which is he says that culture is about beliefs and norms and about giving meaning to people's lives and so on. So in that sense, what he's doing is really tracking the dominant Western conception, right? Even if it's a sort of intuitive conception rather than being well theorized. So what you get with Parekh is simply a reflection in theoretical terms of what is already a kind of ground intuition of Western culture about what culture is, right? So in that sense, I think he's not really doing anything new in terms of providing an original theory of culture. I don't think he's doing that. So see, over the last decade or so, what I've been doing is following the research program at the University of Ghent, initiated by a Professor Balagangadhar, right? Now, this is a very interesting research program because it's called the Comparative Science of Cultures. And so you have culture in there. And in fact, Professor Balagangadhar I've been reading, a couple of his books and realizing that he has come up with a quite different conception of culture. He's also able to explain why it's possible to say that the kind of understanding of culture that I've been describing so far, which seems to be the dominant one, is a Western conception, right? Because it's Western culture which produces the idea that beliefs are important to people, and that comes out of certain kind of Christian anthropological framework about how beliefs are important. They provide the basis for the normative life of people, how they give meaning, yeah, and meaning. The search for meaning is also very Christian conception actually. Of course, today what's happened is that it simply acquired a kind of common sense in the Western culture, and maybe you can say that common sense is also repeated in other parts of the world. But at root, and in fact, in terms of its dependence, we have to go back to Christian theological ideas in order to find why it has gained a kind of currency as a popular or general idea within the culture. To the extent that we don't even excavate it anymore, right? It's not really that regarded as that important. It's become so common sense that it's sort of regarded as self-evident, right? That is what culture is about. But then you find that it's actually specific to very specific to a particular culture, which is the Western culture. And of course, the Western culture is really that culture which has been constituted by Christianity, right? So it's not surprising that there is that that kind of attachment to this particular conception, and that idea has spread through this culture. And so if you go back actually to look at the anthropologists and the multiculturalists like Bhikhu Parekh and so on, actually what they've been writing about is the ground intuition of Western culture, right? As I've been saying repeatedly, but it has its basis in a conception of anthropology which is really Christian, right? Now, Balagangadhar actually goes further, because one of the things he says is that one of the things he does is to also offer a theory of culture, right? He doesn't just say that this, this meaning and beliefs and so on thing is to do with Western culture. He explains why it's possible to say that is part of Western culture, but that in itself is grounded in a theory of culture and cultural differences, right? So he says that, well, actually, you've got, if you look at differences among people, of course, there are a variety of differences among people. There are psychological differences, biological differences, social differences, and so on, right? So one of the problems is to figure out what are the cultural differences. And in the search for this, the answer to this question, he says that, well, actually, if you look at different people, right, in the world, what you have is different types of learning processes. And the arrangement between those kind of learning processes is what gives rise to a configuration of learning, right? And cultures, at least in part, cultures are what configurations of learning are, right? So the way a culture teaches and learns and also produces a kind of idea, mechanism of meta learning, right? So which is about learning to learn, right? How do you produce knowledge in the world, is to do with this idea of meta learning, right? Which means that it's not just about learning and teaching that learning, right? But it's also about being able to produce it, replicate it, etc., right? Apply it to other situations and so on. And so going back to the conception of Western culture, he says that, well, actually, if you look at Western culture, the dominant learning process in Western culture, which is, also is test for knowledge and so on, is theoretical learning. Just one second, I have. Yeah, I apologize, I've gone over. I won't be very much longer, and then we can pick up the other issues in the Q&A. Thanks for your patience. Yeah, so if you look at the Western culture, you'll see that the dominant learning process is theoretical learning. And one of the things this does, why it's a configuration, is that there are other learning processes which exist even in the Western culture, but they become subordinated to the dominant learning process, which is theoretical learning. And so that accounts in a way for the particular way in which Western culture is configured, and how we look at knowledge, how we teach, and so on and so forth. For example, our dominant idea of law is a very theoretical idea of law. We talk about legal theory, right? If you want to look at the converse of that, well, you can find it in Asia, right? So you can say that, well, actually, the dominant process of learning in Asian culture, including Indian culture, is performative learning, right? Performative learning is not something where you produce knowledge about, but you produce knowledge about how to, right? So it's about how to do things. That's what performative learning is. And that's the dominant learning process in a country like India, or, the larger cultural region of Asia. Whereas theoretical learning is a subordinated form of learning in the Asian culture, right? So that particular configuration in which performative learning takes a position of dominance, and theoretical learning takes a subordinate status, is what the Asian configuration of learning is about. And so you can also talk not just about culture, which is about configurations of learning, but how they can be different. And therefore you can talk about cultural differences as well. And I think, just to sort of end, and then we can pick up the issues later on, when you look at situations of cultural contact, so for example, I'm interested in the immigration situation and what happens to descendants of immigrants in a country like Britain, you get a kind of collision, right? So you get some kind of rearrangement of what happens to the culture that the immigrants are bringing with them, right? The kind of cultural baggage they're bringing with them. And there's a very interesting discussion to be had about how that changes, right, upon contact with the dominant culture here, which is the Western culture. And I think it's producing really amazing, very interesting kind of theoretical consequences, which we can pick about, we can talk about later on, right? So I'll just stop for the moment. Thank you for your patience. Sorry to have spilled over into other people's time.
No problem. Thank you, Prakash, for this very illuminating and interesting and, of course, very important topic. Law and culture is one important entry into our wider field, which we address here. So I'm sure we'll come back to that very intensely in our discussion at the end of the input statements. Thank you very much for that. And we move on to Professor Niloufar Bharucha, who hardly needs introduction here, but I still do it out of courtesy, of course, as well. Everyone knows Professor Bharucha in this context. She is director of the Diasporic Constructions of Home and Belonging Indian Diaspora Studies Center and visiting professor in the Humanities CEBS at the University of Mumbai, where she was a senior professor and former head of the Department of English. She is faculty associate emeritus at the Sasi University of the Fraser Valley, Canada, and global faculty of the Fairleigh Dickinson University in the US. She has published widely indeed in the areas of post-colonial literature, the writing of Parsis, and diasporic literature and cinema. Two of her important publications are Rohinton Mystery, Ethnic Enclosures, and Transcultural Spaces, and Indian Diasporic Literature and Cinema. She is also a translator and creative writer. She has been on the jury for literature awards in India and abroad. She has been awarded several national and international scholarships and visiting professorships. Some of them, I'm happy to say, and we have been privileged to have you, Niloufar, as visiting professor several times here in Muenster, and hope so to do this again, actually this summer, for a shorter stint. So a very warm welcome to our next speaker, Professor Bharucha, who will speak on laws and the Indian diaspora, reflections in Jahaji to jet setter literature. We're looking forward to your input statement, Niloufar. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Tierstoffer. And it's good to be among friends, old friends, and new ones as well, such as Prakash from London. Prakash is from the Queen Mary University of London, where I had the privilege of being the Commonwealth Staff Fellow in 1995, much before Prakash's time there. But it had been a good stint for a year at the Queen Mary as well. And of course, doing this webinar, presentation at this webinar actually is by default, because we were hoping to have Chandni Lokuge from Australia, the Monash University, Australia, to make her presentation at this webinar. But unfortunately, family circumstances have prevented her from doing this. And we hope to have her later on in, early in 2021, we hope to have her doing her presentation. She's also a creative writer, so maybe she can talk about her creative writing at a special webcast that we could do for her. We have got other creative writers we have lined up as well, so we hope to have Chandni on that. So I sort of stepped in for Chandni, and I hope my presentation will not be a great disappointment to people who are here today as participants at the webinar. I'm going to make a PowerPoint presentation. It's an exploratory, introductory kind of presentation, not a very theoretical one. So let me begin. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Kirti, can you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Great. I'm going to leave it like that, or maybe I should do the full screen. I should.
Yes, ma'am.
I should do the full screen. Okay, here's the full screen. Laws and the Indian diaspora and the way they are reflected in diasporic Indian literature, from the Jahaji literature, that's going back to the indentured labor literature, right down to the jet setter times. Of course, there really isn't any jet setter literature available at present, but hopefully that should also be happening soon. Just a little map to give an idea of the huge number that we speak of when we speak about the Indian diaspora. Indian diaspora is the second largest diaspora in the world after the Chinese diaspora. So it has a huge impact around the world. We have Prakash sitting here with us from London. We have Kamala Harris soon to become the vice president of the USA. So it is a very influential diaspora in the location where it finds itself, as well as it has an impact on India. India is becoming more and more diaspora conscious than ever before. We have got several kinds of diaspora. So it's not just the post-colonial diaspora of Prakash and Kamala that we are talking about. There was a pre-European diaspora. So it's not just that the Indians started moving around the world with the arrival of the Europeans in India. There always has been a large, there has been a lot of mobility as far as Indians have been concerned around the world. So we have got the pre-European diasporas, about which I'm not going to talk today because we don't have access to any literature. I'm sure there was some literature, but we don't have any access to those records as well. Some records are available, mainly monumental. But we are going to talk about the diasporas in the European colonial period, i.e. the indentured diaspora, as well as the post-colonial diaspora, and talk about how there have been various laws and how these diasporas have been governed by these laws, and how the literatures which have come out of these diasporas have taken into account, have engaged with several laws which have governed these diasporas. So all these diasporas, as I say, have been governed by, have been and continue to be governed by imperial acts in the past and by national laws of the countries to which the diasporics belong today, the Indian diasporics. And these laws evolved from the ones of the 1830s when the first indentured labor were sent abroad to replace the slave labor in various parts of the British colonies, as well as to the laws that govern the migration, the immigration of Indian diasporics to countries such as not just Britain, but to USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as well as other countries. Of course, I won't be really able to take on board all these laws and talk about them today because there just won't be time. But there is a lot of literature available on all these laws. Also, we need to take into account global India and de-diasporization, because thanks to globalization of India from the 1990s onwards and the fact that a lot of the diasporics are choosing to return to India, not just the retired diasporics, but the other diasporics as well. There is a term which has been evolved, and a lot of study has been done or is beginning to be done in the area of de-diasporization. So the importance of the laws which have been put forth by the Indian government from the 1990s onwards, which deal with the OCIs, the Overseas Citizens of India. Earlier, there was something called a PIO, a person of Indian origin, and card, which Feroz Navroji, who I see here, had, and now he's probably an OCI because all the PIOs have become OCIs. And there are, of course, the NRIs who are still deprived of a double citizenship and remain as non-resident Indians, but they are returning to India or partly returning to India. Now, in the colonial period, you had the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese. The Portuguese, of course, arrived much earlier, coming by the 17th century, and by the middle of the 18th century, Britain was the paramount power in India. And 19th century, Britain had consolidated its rule in India, and thanks to the abolition of slavery in 1833, Britain needed replacement labor. And this replacement labor was sought in India. It was sought in other countries, previously in Ireland, but that didn't work out. The Irish were not very meek and mild, and domesticated and didn't work as hard as the Indians, said the British in India. So Indian labor was taken as indentured labor. And this was the beginning of the colonial indentured Indian diaspora. The transport of the indentured labor from India began in 1833 and ended as late as 1916. So it was a very long period that we are talking about, and an estimated 1 million Indian men and women were displayed in ships, jahaj, the Hindi word for ship. That is why we also call them, or they self-identify as jahajis, across the globe in this diaspora. And earlier, these diasporic jahajis were mainly men, and then for various reasons, women were included in moral reasons, usually. They were included in these transports. They were sent far and wide across the globe. And Indian diasporic literature comes from all these places, Mauritius, Fiji, West Indies, etc., etc., etc. Even the French, who were still in India, and they continued to be in India till the 1960s, in Pondicherry mainly, they didn't really have the legal machinery that the British evolved in order to transport the indentured labor. They captured. So they captured the labor, and the labor was taken to various French colonies. Finally banned in 1917 after much pressure from the Imperial Legislative Council of India, thanks to the Indian nationalists, including Mahatma Gandhi. However, migration of indentured labor went on much longer than that, much longer than this legal end to the process, to the procedure. And the last ship of indentured laborers arrived in Mauritius as late as 1924. So from 1834 to 1837, there was a rudimentary contract, which was called an agreement, which was used to transport these laborers who became indentured laborers. Then 1837, there were some new laws. Then in 1842, there were new laws. And in 1882, there was an Immigration Act passed by the government of India, which was the act which actually continued to be in force till 1908 and governed the indentured labor emigration right till the end of the last legal transport in 1960. So the indentured laborers, this group, this 1 million people who were displaced around the globe, self-identified, as I said, as jahajis. They also self-identified as girmitiyas. Girmitya was a corruption, a Hindi corruption of the word agreement, the English word agreement. So they were there as part of this agreement, which they had supposedly entered into with the various contractors. This is, and most of these laws which I've spoken about, they were observed in the breach rather than actually observed. So they were there on record to keep the liberals happy at home in Britain and to keep the nationalists happy in India, but they were not really observed properly. And this is just, most of them were apocryphal. And you have this is a, of course, they were handwritten, most of these agreements. But you see, this is a sample agreement for a laborer. And it says November 1837, after the second set of laws were evolved. And it's very cleverly worded. So there is a name, the name of the laborer, but the laborer cannot read. They could not usually read, they were illiterate. So at the end of the agreement, you have Peru and his mark being the thumb impression. So Peru didn't really know what he was putting his thumb impression to, or even the fact that his name was Peru. And look at that, they were usually taken as field servants. They were taken to work in the cane fields and the cotton fields. But it said that they were being transferred by mutual consent. They were not slaves, okay? Transferred by mutual consent. They were taken as khidmatgars. Khidmatgars were body servants, personal servants, like valets maybe. And they had to actually get all these things. This was put down in the agreement, amount of food they would get, provisions they would get, the clothes they would get, the medical assistance. And this was all, of course, not really put into practice at all. This is and of course, the British Raj was very good at documenting. And later on, with the arrival of photography, they took photographs. But before that, there were sketches, and they actually deployed painters to India to sketch the various ethnic groups, including the Parsis that Klaus spoke about, saying that I specialize in the writing of the Parsi. Look at this group. This was a typical group. And you see one adult male, one adult female, 3 adolescent boys, not necessarily related to one another, one very young boy and one 8 or 10 years old. And look at what is tied around their necks. This was the agreement. This was the thing that they had put their thumb marks on. They went with this tied around their neck. So they were all legal. They were not slaves. All right, very, very careful about that. These were the jahaj, the ships in which they were sent. And this is a sketch. Again, they were sketch showing laborers landing in Mauritius around 1842. And you see this group of colonials. You see the official groups with these hats, and you see the kind of the planter group, and you see this young boy, probably adolescent, not even properly dressed, just wearing a kacha around his nether regions. Post-colonial Indian diasporas, let's move on there. Now, this was the indentured diaspora. I'll get back to it in a while. Now, the post-colonial Indian diasporas were also labor, they were academic, as well as they were professional. And why did they happen? Just as the end of slavery was a reason for the indentured diaspora, the end of the Second World War, the fatalities of the Second World War, the huge lacuna in the labor markets after the Second World War meant that labor was required once again by Europe, mainly England, although England was the victor nation as far as the Second World War was concerned. Large number of skilled, semi-skilled workers were recruited by British factories, just as there's the scandal about the Windrush happening in the UK right now. Similarly, labor was recruited, professionals were recruited from India. There were advertisements over the All India Radio, which had already started in the 1930s. There were handbills distributed in villages and small towns all around India. They were stuck on walls asking for laborers, asking for professionals. The National Health Service was coming in by the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s. So Indian doctors, Indian nurses, teachers, Indian teachers who were trained in the colonial academic system, they were needed and they went. Similarly, you had the post-colonial diaspora happening in Canada, to a lesser extent in New Zealand and Australia, where the returning soldiers from the First World War and the Second World War stayed back in those countries, became farmers, became laborers. So that was the beginning of the post-colonial diaspora. Today, the post-colonial diaspora extends to the Arab states. There are also professionals like doctors and chartered accountants, teachers, professors. And this is also called the petro-diaspora because it's the petroleum-rich Arab world which wants these people. Of course, with the breaking out of the pandemic, most of these people who were on work permits, not on residential permits, but on work permits, were promptly dispatched back to India. And there was a huge number of planes, Air India flights again, which were dispatched to the UAE, to various parts of the Arab world to bring back these Indian laborers who were not required during the pandemic as there was this lockdown happening there. The other post-colonial diasporas, I spoke about the academic diaspora. A lot of students went abroad, not just to England, but now increasingly to the USA, then Canada, and later in the 1990s to Australia and to New Zealand. And in the USA, they became the NRIs, the non-resident Indians, who did not surrender their Indian passports, but there being no double citizenship allowed by India, they remained non-resident Indians. Other European countries also have the postcolonial diasporas, Pondicherry, Portugal, from where the Goan diaspora has spread out to other parts of the European Union where they can live and work. There is the Indian diaspora in Germany. Germany has the refugee diaspora from Sri Lanka, the Tamilian Indian refugee diaspora from Sri Lanka. It also has the transnational Indian diaspora, and over 60,000 diasporic Indians live and work in Germany today. Belgium, Netherlands, there's a huge diaspora, Indian diaspora also in Russia. Australia and New Zealand, as I said, had a much older diaspora during the colonial period. But then because of the white-only Australia, white-only New Zealand policies, which changed later on in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, gradually, more and more Indian diasporics have moved to these countries. Also, there are transnational diasporics who are not actually permanently living in those countries, especially those new nations that I spoke about, but keep moving back and forth between India on contracts. Mainly, they are mainly software engineers, and they are computer professionals. They are the transnationals. Now, Prakash has been talking to us about cultural practices, and the diasporas are marked. They are the diaspora, otherwise they just melt into the general population. But the Indian diaspora, 100 years plus in the West Indies, haven't disappeared into the general population. They haven't disappeared into the general population in any of the countries where they have chosen to live or they were taken involuntarily. So what marks them are their cultural practices. And as far as the indentured diaspora was concerned, they were mainly illiterate people from deep within the rural hinterlands of India who were transported first from Calcutta and then later ports like Madras as well. They didn't have any of the resources that the NRIs have. They didn't have films. They didn't have cultural associations. They didn't have the digital media as diasporics do today. They had to fall back upon some basic cultural artifacts that they took with them, which mark them as Indians. And as far as of course, it were not just Hindus who were taken as indentured labor, even Muslims were taken. But we are talking about the majority group, which were the Hindus. Now, the cult text of the Hindus, which kept alive the Indian culture in diaspora, was the religious epic Ramayana. And this nurtured ancient Indian values of morality, ethics, family love, respect for elders. And it kept alive also, of course, it's not that they could read it. Maybe one or two people in that diasporic group, one of the groups which went on the Jahaj, they could read. And they were not necessarily Brahmins, although Brahmins were also taken. And V.S. Naipaul was very careful to keep reiterating that his ancestors belonged to the Brahmin caste. Coming back to the indentured labor, they were not necessarily Brahmins, but thanks to the fact that they needed priests for marriages, priests for births, priests for death rituals. Any literate person within the group became a kind of a nominal priest. He could read the Ramayana, they did parts, oral readings of the Ramayans, keeping alive these old traditions, the cultural values. Also kept alive were the languages. And it's interesting, very, very interesting, that they haven't lost their languages. The Sindhis in India are in great danger today of losing the Sindhi language. The second and third generation descendants of those who came from Sindh during the partition of India have experienced or are experiencing language loss. But these Indians from the West Indies and South Africa, in Fiji. They kept alive their own Creole-like languages. So even if, and they write in that, there is literature which has been produced in these languages, and their own versions. And these were versions of Hindi and Marathi and Tamil and God knows what else, before the standardization of these languages in India. The standardizations which took place late 19th century in India, the colonial standardization of Indian languages. This is pre that. These are those pre-standardization languages, and a literature has been produced in that. Literature of the indentured diaspora. So by the middle of the 20th century, increasing literacy and education meant that the indentured diaspora and their descendants began to write creatively, began to document themselves, to write themselves into existence. And this literature is available in Mauritius, Caribbean, etc., etc., etc. Not just in English, but in Indian languages. And some of these diasporics then moved from those original diaspora locations to Canada, to USA and UK, like M.G. Vasanji, for instance, the Canadian writer who is of double diasporic origins, India as well as Africa. And they have noted, they have documented themselves. A few pictures of these writers from that, the indentured diaspora. Brijlal, Naipaul, Vijay Mishra, Sam Selvin. Okay. Now, what were the characteristic features of this indentured diaspora literature? Lot of nostalgia, lot of pain, lot of alienation, feeling of being unhomed. And theorists of diaspora writing have written that a lot of these diasporics looked at themselves as Rams, so many Rams, Lord Rams, in exile following the Ramayana stories. And there was also the ignominy of being called coolies. Now they came from, maybe they were extremely poor, but they had something called self-respect, and that was completely crushed when they were called coolies. Now this tradition of longing for the homeland is part of the Hindi literature tradition of the Videsya writing. My beloved has gone abroad. I miss my beloved. When will my beloved return? And this is to be found in songs and ghazals and light classical music, which has been in recent years, after the diaspora consciousness in India being propagated even in India itself. And those of you who know something about Indian ghazals will know that there's a very famous ghazal by Pankaj Udas, which talks about Chithi aayi hai. So the letter has come from home. So this is the diaspora person in wherever he is, Fiji, Mauritius, getting a letter from home, remembering his parents, his grandparents, his village, etc. Now the early literature by the diasporics, I said it's not really available, but by the end of the 19th century, we do have some witness texts. Like with the Black American writers, you have the diaries and journals, the slave journals, the slave diaries. Here you have some witness texts available, and one very important witness text that we have access to, fortunately, is one by this man called Totaram Sandhya, who was sent to Fiji at the end of the 19th century, 1890s. And he has written about his time on the ship, the time that he spent. He was there for over 20 years. He was not a priest, but he became a priest once he reached there. And he wrote this book in Hindi, not the standardized Hindi, but the kind of the dialect Hindi, Bhutlen ki Katha, the haunted lines, the barracks where these diasporic indentured labor were kept. And what is very important about this particular witness text is that when he returned to India, he got in touch with the Indian nationalists. And Indian nationalists like Gokhale, Tilak, Gandhi, who had by then returned from South Africa. Gandhi, of course, had first-hand experience of South African diaspora. But the horrendous living conditions, the working conditions of the indentured labor, the kind of corporal punishment that they received, the whippings and things like that, led a lot of the Indian nationalists to campaign for the end of this practice. So Totaram Sandhya's Bhutlen Ki Katha, which has also been translated into English, is available, has been reprinted in recent years, is a very important text. Now, post-colonial Indian diaspora literature, but from the 1970s onwards, you have this literature. Just like you have the characteristic features of loss, pain, alienation, you have this whole issue of identity and the struggle between the old homeland and the new homeland. Feroz Navroji, who I can see on my screen, is a second generation post-colonial or colonial / post-colonial diasporic. But his children and his grandchildren would definitely have this struggle at some point or the other, if they are not having it, with issues of identity, loss of the old homeland. And this whole idea of not belonging, whether you belong to the old homeland or you belong to the new homeland. And this whole, for women, the women diasporics, this whole issue of Indian patriarchy, patriarchal traditions which are carried into diasporic spaces, makes this issue of belonging and identity even more complicated. How do we see these reflections? Now, as far as Totaram was concerned, we saw these reflections in his Bhutlen Katha, the laws, the agreements under which they were taken to places like Fiji. But you have Indian diasporic writers like Bharti Mukherjee, who has written novels like Jasmine, Middlemen and Other Stories about laws under which these diasporics either make themselves or go to places like the USA or are deported from places like the USA. There is Kiran Desai's book, The Inheritance of Loss, in which she talks about the illegals, a lot of illegal Indian diasporics today who go on tourist visas and overstay, or who go on little boats from Cuba and places like that, land clandestinely in little ports around Florida and then disappear into the American mainland. So she has written a lot about these various laws, how they flee from these enforcers of the law. There is also Salman Rushdie's East-West Stories. And there is also Salman Rushdie writing about deportation laws in the UK. And that is in his infamous book, Satanic Verses, which unfortunately hasn't been read much except for those infamous parts. But he's got extremely lovely sections, important sections as far as we are concerned, on London and how there are these deportation centers all around, spread all around the coastal areas of Britain, from where these people are. If they are caught entering Britain clandestinely, or they have overstayed, or they have always been in Britain, like with the Windrush generation, but now it is discovered that they don't have the legal right to stay on in Britain, they are sent to these deportation centers. Rohinton Mistry has written about Canada, and Prakash was talking about multiculturalism, and he's very scathingly critical of the Canadian multicultural laws and Canada's kind of propagation of its multicultural image. So he writes about it in his short stories like Squatter and Swimming Lessons. These are some of the writers of the post-colonial Indian diaspora. And I'll end with this. I hope I have not overstayed my welcome with you. Now, the journey of the Indian diaspora across time and space now stretches from the 1830s to the second decade of the 21st century and is spread out over 100 countries, as you might have seen from the map that I showed at the beginning. From being the derided coolies in their new homelands, the diasporics have become influential politicians, prosperous businessmen, industrialists. The descendants of the indentured labor have been knighted by the British and given awards in America and other places. In India, thanks to the diaspora consciousness that I've been talking about, Pravasi Bharati awards have been given by the Indian homeland to the diasporics. Many of them have stood witness to their own lives and the lives of their descendants, their ancestors, and acts of memory, re-memory, post-memory, as Marion Hirsch calls it, and it's available in literature and cinema today. Cinema is a very important medium for diasporics to deal with these issues today. They have written and made films, and so that you do not forget what they have endured, and in spite of everything, what they have achieved. Their lives, their past and present, were woven together into very tightly knit laws, which created complex schemes across oceans and continents and gave them an identity that included elements of Indianness as well as elements of their new worlds. And these laws, like we heard Prakash talking about culture, language is important, religion is important, location is important, time is important, space is important, gender is important in expressions of or elements of culture. My culture as a Parsi Indian woman is different from Kirti's culture as a Hindu Indian woman belonging to a different generation, although we are both from the city of Mumbai, all right? So very, very complex issues, whether we are in diaspora or are not in diaspora. And language, India, Prakash, had language riots, linguistic reorientation of states in the 1960s. Language is a very, very important issue in India today, has always been. So it's not just something that the West has to deal with. India has to deal with linguists. We dealt with linguistic riots. I was a young girl when the Marathi and Gujarati riots took place outside our home in Mumbai. And the result of which the Bombay state was divided into the two linguistic states of Maharashtra and Gujarat. Karnataka is still fighting with Maharashtra over the ownership of Belgaum, which the Maharashtrians considered as a Marathi-speaking area and belonging to Maharashtra, and the Karnataka state has been given to them. There is also Tanjore and many, many places where the linguistic fights and quarrels still persist to this day. And going back to what I was saying, these laws which govern the diasporic at times have been unfair. They have been blatantly racist. The white-only laws for various former colonies and dominions of the British Empire, discriminatory. But the Indian diasporics have kept working within the legal and constitutional systems of their old and new homelands in the past as well as the present, to make for themselves a more fair system of justice. Thank you. Thank you, Klaus.
Thank you very much, Professor Bharucha, for this further elaboration on Indian diaspora. And I always think ever again when I listen to it and hear about it, talking about Indian literature or Indian law and literature, without considering this massive and widespread Indian diaspora is, I think, would be a grave neglect. India is so much more, and we have to ever keep this in mind, than what happens within its current national boundaries. It's really, to use the buzzword from Prakash's talk, a culture which is really global in its multifacetedness and variety, of course. So thank you very much for this jumping in the breach as well, Professor Bharucha, with an excellent contribution here. And we move on to our third speaker today, Professor Janet Wilson. She is Emeritus Professor at the University of Northampton, UK, although she currently hails from her homeland, New Zealand. In Northampton, she was previously Professor of English and Postcolonial Studies. And as a New Zealander, she has published widely on the postcolonial writing and visual culture of the white settler cultures of New Zealand and Australia. Her specialisms include diaspora writing, and she has written on New Zealand women travelers and expatriates, notably Catherine Mansfield. Fleur Adcock and Janet Rem, and edited the stories of the publisher, writer Dan Davin. Other research areas are in law, literature, citizenship and diaspora, the writing of refugee and asylum seekers, slum narratives, literature and globalization, religion and fundamentalism, right-wing rhetoric. She has published widely in this field, recently on Catherine Mansfield, New Direction, a book she co-edited with Emmy Gaston and Jerry Kimber, and she's currently writing on offshore islands of Aotearoa, New Zealand, sites as startups for fiction, for a special issue of interventions. She is, I should also point out, editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Postcolonial Writing with Routledge, and has a number of other functions in various publication sites. Janet Wilson will talk to us today on activist citizenship, law, literature, and diaspora, Jenny Erpenbeck's Go, Went, Gone of 2015. We're looking forward to your talk, Janet. Very warm welcome once again to you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And thanks to Nilüfer and to Kriti for inviting me to this webinar, and to Professor Bahadi for welcoming us. And I'd like to also say hello to Prakash Shah, whom I haven't seen since he came to Northampton about 7 or 8 years ago. And I see also Dieter Riemenschneider is here as well. Hello. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I had planned with Chandani Lokuk we had planned companion pieces, but sadly, because she's not able to be here, my paper stands on its own. But I'm greatly honored to be in the company of Nilüfer Baruka and of Prakash Shah. So I want to talk tonight here, where I am in New Zealand, 11 o'clock. I think probably quite a long way ahead of all of the rest of you. This paper looks at the triangulated relationship between the disciplines of law, diaspora, and literature, drawing on a single strand common to all, that is citizenship and its changing forms, especially under the pressure of refugee migration. Literature's place in this is in dramatizing the tensions between the law and undocumented migrants, especially from the global south, who create their own new diasporas. And it gives a human angle to arguments over legal adjudications concerning national inclusion or exclusion. In these terms, genres like refugee writing or migration narratives encompass not just the lives of refugees, but also what has been defined as a crisis in citizenship due to new modes of agency, individual incentive, and political participation, as migrant mobility has become a more urgent force in policy and social life. These forms of citizen activism and collective endeavor mobilize against the rulings of nation states that find ways to bypass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and develop new forms of exclusion in dealing with asylum seekers, often under the pressure of xenophobia and vilification of refugees. They intensify a shift that began with the globalization of the nation state in the 1980s, with deregulation, the development of international human rights regimes, and the emergence of multiple actors and communities that involve new citizenship practices. These pose a challenge to more established modes of citizenship, identified with national entitlement and belonging. And I just want to refer briefly to the Diaspora Studies reader that Klaus Tierstoffer and I published, where we say this is the state-centered distribution of citizenship that casts citizens as consumers in a territorialized political system. So this is the system that's being shifted away from in new citizenship practices. Literature facilitates more empathetic responses to refugees and recognition of individual suffering by expanding its imaginative capacities to dramatize spaces outside current modes of citizenship. My point of exemplification is the celebrated novel by Jenny Erpenbeck, Gehen ging gegangen in German, or Go Went Gone in English, published in 2015, which dramatizes a sharing of space and understanding between citizens and refugees and presenting an alternative to interpretations of the law that seem cold and impersonal. As the lawyer in the novel says, where laws are pure and simple, formulated with such a high degree of precision and abstraction that all basis in human emotion has become superfluous. The present day issue that the novel tackles is the predicament of a group of refugees from the global south who've survived the journey across the Mediterranean and seek asylum status in Germany. The question of how such refugee voices can be conveyed so that they're actually heard, of how the sans-papiers can be represented, is of course a crucial one that everyone asks. Drawing on a real-life case, Erpenbeck goes beyond the individual story of hardship and suffering, although these are at the core of her novel, and she explores the potential of citizenship. In Kim Rugiel's words, this lies in the ability to act and disrupt the normal order of things. In the case of this novel, by advocating for refugees. Although I should say that this potential to disrupt is not realized in the novel because the changing of the current practices of inclusion and exclusion is not achieved. Her protagonist, a Berlin citizen, gets involved in the standoff between refugees from the north and west of Africa and the legal structures which constrain them, and helps prepare their case for permission to stay and work in the city. When this fails, he and a group of friends offer caring and unconditional hospitality to the refugees, so compensating for the inhumane adjudications of the law. The novel focuses on the subjectivity of Richard, a middle-aged, recently retired professor of classics at Humboldt University in East Berlin, who considers the official rejection of the refugees' demands as unjust. His life changes as he gets to know them, hearing their stories, interacting with them, and becoming aware of his ignorance about so much that happens in the world outside Europe. He begins to revise his assumptions about his own belonging and place in history. Through Richard's orientation as a European academic and classicist, Erpenbeck questions the bourgeois worldview, the understanding of German nationalism, German and European asylum policies, narratives of colonialism, and post-war Germany. Part 2. The political background of Go Went Gone is the hardening of official attitudes towards refugees who poured into Europe in the last decade from the global south, Syria, and Yemen. Evident in the assigning of quotas and allocations, new borders between states like Greece and Turkey, the reinforcing of detention as a policy of long-term encampment, that's a quote, and quote, the de facto solution to the problem of unwanted and superfluous people. In these cases, refugees who travel as undocumented migrants are effectively reduced to what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life, robbed of personhood. The novel's international legal framework, by contrast to its political one, is dominated by legislation concerning the access of migrants to and their settlement in European territories, which has been imposed as the right of sovereign states and the EU. And I refer here to the EU-wide framework known as the Dublin Ii Regulation, first adopted in 2003, which decrees that migrants register for asylum in the first EU member state they enter. Dublin II has been criticised as one of the, quote, legal black holes of the migration crisis. And as evidence, according to G.S. Godwin Gill, the leading authority of the Refugee Convention, of the desire of nation states to, quote, leave migrants beyond the scope of their legal duties under constitutional and international law. Richard, in the novel, identifies this legislation in Germany as a metaphoric form of border control, saying the inhabitants of Germany are defending their borders with articles of law. The refugees from Northern and Western Africa, countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Niger, and Burkina Faso, have first arrived in Italy, where there's no work. They've then moved to Germany in search of employment. Their fates are to be decided according to the state government of Berlin's ruling on the legal measure of Dublin II, as Italy, not Germany, is their first European country, as to whether they can work in Germany. This is at the heart of the narrative. Lacking any entitlements or opportunity to seek asylum in Germany, the migrants are like forced nomads with little or no agency. Erpenbeck's protagonist recognizes the problem, the inconsistency of the migration and asylum policies implemented by the different EU nations. Italy lets migrants travel to other countries to search for work because it's the first point of contact for so many people from Africa, but Germany only allows them a short-term stay before returning them to Italy. There's a constant sort of frustration. This means that when they arrive in Germany, the human rights concerns that they be treated as victims of war, persecution, or discrimination can be ignored. As Goodwin Gill argues, the Dublin Regulation is symptomatic of all that is wrong with the European approach to asylum seekers, because the sovereign EU states are unable to coordinate their efforts on this difficult issue touching sovereignty, security, and of course, the other. The novel is based on the real-life occupation of Oranienplatz, the public square in central Berlin neighborhood of Kreuzberg that began in 2012 and ended in April 2014, and that sparked tent protests against German refugee policy in major German cities. The African refugees have moved from Oranienplatz to demonstrate outside Alexanderplatz, the square outside Berlin's town hall. They refuse to speak and draw attention to their erased presence by displaying a sign saying, quote, "We become visible," unquote, introducing from this place of enunciative exclusion the paradox of being visible but silent, as if simultaneously dead and alive, representing what Homi Bhabha calls, quote, ontological deprivation, unquote. Richard is a touchstone for the neoliberal reader. He questions the Berlin Senate's motives in seeming to offer concessions to the refugees, better living conditions, a stipend, vocational opportunity, especially after he discovers from a lawyer friend that they have only temporary suspension of deportation. So why does the German Senate go through this charade of offering them something better? His voice and those of his friends who disagree with these official decisions are contradicted by the majority view of law-abiding Berlin citizens, who are represented by a chorus in the novel, have no names, no presence really. They find irreconcilable cultural differences from refugees, an attitude that hints at invisible racialization, according to El Tayeb, and that non-whiteness is seen as equivalent to non-Europeanness. They say there are so many of them. They ask, what will they live on? They say, even if we help them, the problem won't be solved. Familiar sounds. This clash over cultural and moral understanding about what is right and wrong is on which the emotional dimension of citizenship is based, according to Plato, constitutes a rift within the Berlin community. But Erpenbeck bypasses this to introduce alternative concepts of a compassionate citizenship, as Richard's is, as his activism moves into a form of communitas based on unconditional hospitality. This emphasis on acts rather than doers confirms the point of the critic engine Eisen, that what is at stake in the new citizenship is not the person, it's not who the citizen is, but what makes the citizen, what they do. The Berlin Senate decides to follow the letter of the law. That is, it says, the responsibility of the man who landed in Italy is to be borne by Italy alone. Nor will it grant the man residence permits according to the Residence Act, which would override Dublin II, though it has discretion to do so, claiming this is not in Germany's political interests. The novel's counter-argument is produced by the lawyer that Richard consults, who sees a disconnect between the legislature and the emotional bonds of the community. And furthermore, notes the erasure of the German cultural heritage in this rejection of unconditional hospitality. This is in the traditional sense that Tacitus uses in his work, Germania, quote, "It is accounted a sin to turn any man away from your door." Although the Senate's decision is the narrative's turning point, the point of the novel is different. It's the empathic citizen practices that follow this decision, involving ethical caring and hospitality, compensating for the fact that strangers are denied basic rights. That is, the novel's emotional, moral climax is in the gesture of Richard and his friends of taking the 12 refugee strangers into their homes and caring for them prior to their deportation. So compensating for the lack of hospitality and common sense in this literal application of the law. There's no solution to the novel's refugee crisis, but rather another angle. How to offer ethical commitment through a citizenship practice that is, quote, participatory politics centered on the human rights and duties of personhood rather than the rights and duties of the nation state. So it splits wide apart that division I've been talking about between the two types of citizenship. Next section, Erpenbeck introduces what I call a politics of vulnerability in her vision of citizenship, one which recognizes the precariousness of human life. Richard lives within Western European cultural parameters, and as a privileged academic, has always worked according to familiar, reassuring routines. He has to unlearn his assumptions. His determination to take the path of advocacy involves emotional risk-taking and engaging in the refugees' affective realm of radical alterity, according to Homi Bhabha. Political persecution, psychic trauma, displacement, and end-of-life scenarios. In his responses to the stories of the North Africans, stories of war, death, and brutality, he shows the workings of prosthetic memory, according to Alison Landsberg. That is, the memories of others are sufficient to produce empathy in him and to change and revise his political commitments. Their stories are a trigger for a reassessment of all the political, historical, and cultural influences on his life. Something similar, and I don't have time to go into all that, but something similar is shown by his friends. The wife of his friend Detlef puts herself into the shoes of the other in an ironic reversal of perception, commenting, someday it'll be us having to flee with no one to help us. So she sees the refugees' position almost from the point of view of what it might have been like to have lived in Nazi Germany. Erpenbeck also provides a metaphoric dimension that stresses the vulnerability of human life. The image of a man drowned in a nearby lake, trapped below the surface, whose body has not been discovered. The implication of no burial, mourning, or psychic closure is fused with images of the refugees' lives being in suspense, of being simultaneously alive and dead. More generally, this metaphor of floating, being suspended in death, images the partial burial and visibility of all refugee experience, buried in memory, unable to be articulated. Finally, Richard's individual crisis emerges from a shared experience of alienation and dislocation. One of the refugees talks of his identity loss due to the war that destroyed his life and that of his family. He says, I don't know where to go. I can't see myself anymore. I don't know who I am anymore. And this is reflected in Richard's own perception of his life, which suddenly comes to him as, quote, completely foreign, utterly unknown, as if from a far-off galaxy. As Rosie Brodotti says in commenting on the alienation that both experience, the process of untangling oneself from common ways of identifying with familiar identities and belonging entails a disidentification from the naturalized link between citizen and nation. And this is the process that Richard is undergoing. Next section, fiction's cultural role as humanistic compensation to the law's limitation. Its ability to represent the migrant's world outside the law, but also at the same time from within conventional social norms, takes many generic formats. Much new writing has an Islamic emphasis. For example, there's an allegory of forced migration in Pakistani writer Mohsin Hamid's recent novel, Exit West. There are developments in the Arab novel of migration beyond the account of Tayyib Salih, who wrote Season of Migration in the 1960s. These are written from the angle of the Haraza, those who burn their citizenship documents, and explore the new borderlands, the spaces outside citizenship, such as the Ethiopian writer Abi Bakr Kal, who writes a novel called African Titanics, and the Iraqi writers Abbas Kida and Hassan Blassim. There are hybrid collections of narratives, collaborations between citizen advocates and refugees that blend documentary, semi-biography, and fiction. Erpenbeck's novel is in fact based on interviews with 13 refugees from the Iranian plats, whom she thanks in her afterward. Similar are the 3 collections titled Refugee Tales, published in England, where contemporary writers and activists co-narrate with refugees and asylum seekers their stories, feature polemical introductions that demand an end to indefinite detention in the UK, indefinite detention of asylum seekers and refugees. It's usually accepted that literary interventions like Go Went Gone are not enough to change official policy or make a difference in real life terms. But Erpenbeck's emphasis on vulnerability extends to the law in a way that's very suggestive. It implies that legal decisions are provisional, arbitrary, subjective, made in response to political and social pressures. They're not objective. The Senate chose not to exercise its privilege of overturning Dublin II on this occasion, but it could do so on others. Furthermore, the novel was published at a crucial moment, just 1 week before Angela Merkel opened Germany's borders to refugees in 2015. And it was hailed as, quote, novel of the hour, novel of the season, novel of the political situation. So along with the groundswell of opinion about the plight of refugees aroused by the Iranian plats occupation, it may have been a deciding factor in encouraging a new law that allows refugees to seek work in Germany after a restricted period. To sum up, the dramatic and moral functions of storytelling appear in Erpenbeck's multi-axial and intersectional representations of 12 refugees as believable figures with individual histories. These enable a mapping of her visibility-invisibility dialectic to show that overlooked, anonymized lives are valuable and grievable, reminding us of Judith Butler's argument that, quote, in the politics of migration, some lives as perceived as lives, while others fail to assume perceptual form as such. In accounting for the impact of their stories on Richard and on how they change his life, the novel helps raise the consciousness of readers about the fates of stateless and displaced persons whose political citizenship depends on the right to have rights, as Hannah Arendt said. To return to the triangulated relationship between law, literature, and diaspora, Erpenbeck's novel represents the urgent goals of citizen activism as a humanitarian response to the laws which ignore the human cost of radical displacement. These literary functions as a correction to the law, as well as showing the expansion of citizenship consciousness, may finally be contextualized in relation to Lindsay Stonebridge's point that the refugee today has become central to all such discourses. That is, she says, the rightlessness of stateless people is also the history of the changing meaning of political and national citizenship in the later 20th and early 21st centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wilson, for introducing us to indeed a German context, which of course has much wider reverberations and much wider significance within our broader argument in this webinar. And I extend my gratitude to all three speakers at this point and will not attempt to sum up what has been said in these three talks again, especially with a look at the time which is hastening ahead. I think all three talks have again shown to us that what we can say about law and literature, or law in general, is that law is not the culprit as such in deficiencies which we discover when we look at what is the legal status of migrants, of diasporas and their special approaches to law, of refugees and their status within legal systems. One thing one can say, of course, laws, national laws, international laws have to be developed and advanced, and other discourses and other ways of thinking have to contribute to that, and law will be, and the judiciaries and legislative bodies will be well advised to include other discourses, for example, literature, which we propound here. On the other hand, I think there's also the insight that law as such will never be enough, and it's just one institution and one way of approaching central questions of our global world today. And the central question, of course, which law will always be addressed at and will look at for, is justice and equity worldwide and in national contexts. And even there, we think that law is just one of the agents and the channels how this can be achieved. Other social formations can contribute to that and are sometimes as important. And the dialogue between various social and cultural formations will be very important in achieving better results there. So law is not alone, we could say, in attempting to improve the situation under these changing social circumstances formed by migration and diasporas and refugee statuses and so on. So I think with these words, let's enter into a discussion of the three talks together. And I'm sure there are remarks, comments from everyone who has been here. Please come forward with any questions to individual speakers, but most welcome also commentaries and extensions to what has been said. So with this, I open the floor for contributions from everyone. You can contribute by writing questions or comments, which I will read out in the chat function, or by just showing me or Kirti your hand. And it's perhaps best if Kirti manages the signals. Or should I do that? I can do that. I can. We're not such a crowd today, so I can see
Yes. So we
whoever
could,
wants to speak.
yeah, if we could have the participants with questions just unmuting and talking to us
Yeah,
because of
easy.
the lesser number of participants, would that be okay?
Yeah, sounds
Okay.
good to me.
Great. So the floor is open. So whoever has questions could just unmute and ask your questions, please.
Or make a point.
Yes.
Should I just, if I may, just pick up a couple of the points that Nilofer ji made about some issues?
Sure, sure.
Yeah. Nilofer ji made this point about the language riots and so on in India. And that's of course true, right? It's not as though I wasn't recognizing that such events have happened. But in fact, what I was trying to say is that they are really a function of colonialism and the way in which certain identities have been introduced as a result of colonialism. Not that, and of course, I would like to see if there is evidence. Of course, I would like to see where there is evidence of language riots and such like anywhere in Asia prior to colonialism. So that was my first point. The second point is a more theoretical one about culture. You see, when I'm arguing for a particular theoretical standpoint on culture, we have to first bear in mind what function a theory performs, right? So if you look at the natural sciences, in natural sciences, theories are very specific things. So for example, you might have a theory which has uses the word mass, but in that theory, the word mass would be performing a very particular type of function which has a meaning, which has relevance for that particular theoretical framework, right? So when I'm talking about culture with reference to Balagangathar's work, I'm using it as a theoretical term, right? So I don't think it's an answer to that, the introduction of that theoretical framework to say, well, everybody has their own sort of individual culture. Some people are Parsis and other people are Hindus and so on. That's not the point, right? Or you could equally say, yes, how can you talk about Western culture when there are Italians and, Klaus is German and, surely there's no such thing as Western culture because of, my point is not to deny variety, right? One can talk about larger cultural units without denying variety. It's consistent to be able to do that. So within the theoretical framework of Balagangadhar, you can be Italian and you can be Western as well. Or you can be Parsi and you can have an Indian culture. So that's the standpoint from which I was working.
If I might just respond to the later part of what Prakash has been saying about culture, I wasn't denying that being a Parsi doesn't make me an Indian, and being multicultural, understanding it from the literary point of view rather than from the theoretical angle that you have been talking about. Multiculturalism could mean, if you are able to allow for that, could mean, what the Canadian government talks about multiculturalism, being tolerant, being aware, giving space to different cultures. So if you're in a multicultural society, whether it is Canada or India or Britain, it means being aware that yours is not the dominant culture, is not the only culture. That's all I was trying to say. Not taking on board what the theorists that you have been speaking about. I haven't read them, so in fact I should get hold of those theorists and go through them. Thank you for drawing our attention to it.
Could I ask a question of Prakash Shah?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
I was intrigued that you seem to be setting up a scientific definition of culture as though it was a kind of ideal that might be reached, yet you simply put this forward as a lack in the current climate intellectually, and then moved on to multiculturalism as though this was somehow a substitute, which has been developed out of the way society has moved, or different societies have moved together and sought new rationales for their togetherness or their not togetherness, as the case may be. And I just wonder how you reconcile these two sort of impulses, whether you can, find a scientific definition that actually, what's the word for it, gets away from some of the issues of multiculturalism, or whether there is no such prospect. I'm intrigued. I'm really intrigued by it, because I'm not quite sure where you would find such a definition, unless you were to move the boundaries of what culture is, as it were.
Yeah. Well, as a preface, I'm not really sure if I understood the question, but what I'm trying to put forward is not merely a definition, but it's part of a theoretical claim about what culture is. See, you could define something any way you like. You could, I could say a table is 3 legs, it has 4 legs, or it could be both things or whatever. But here, what we're saying is, what is the phenomenon that culture is, right? And it's not only that. It's not just something that I mean this when I refer to culture. A theory has to do something more, right? It has to tell us something deeper about the phenomenon, so that we can test it out. It can have some kind of empirical consequences, so that you can generate some consequences from it, and so on. So it's not. We have to clearly separate the idea of a definition and idea of a theory. And of course, the best example of theories are the theories of natural sciences, right? So that's why I was using the kind of analogy between theoretical terms in natural sciences and what we're trying to do with culture here. As far as the point about multiculturalism is concerned, the only thing I was trying to draw attention to is how under-theorized culture is within the multiculturalist writing. And of course, at a kind of superficial level, you can say, well, haha, these guys claim to be multiculturalists, but they don't even have a grasp of culture. But of course, that's also a point that I would make. But I think the deeper point is, it is to draw attention to a lack of theorization, and to ask the question, how can a theory of multiculturalism progress without a solid theorization of culture? Because then it wouldn't really, you couldn't really have the kind of consequences that you would want from theoretical conceptualization. So we don't know what would flow. For example, when Parek talks about beliefs and norms, right? And making meaning and not only Parek, they all do that. All the writers of multiculturalism, they tend to do that, except perhaps Modud, who doesn't even try. You see, if I was going to take that as a given and say, yes, actually, that is what culture is, and I can build a theory around that, what he would do, for example, to Indians coming, Indians in India, or Indians who come as immigrants to the West, what he would do is it would demand that the way their traditions function are based on belief. They have foundations in beliefs and a normative foundation. and that they are constantly engaged in a search for meaning. But I would doubt very much, I would contest very much, in fact, whether or not the kind of set of traditions that Indian culture is composed of have any particular foundation, whether it be it in beliefs or rationality or whatever, right? So I would also say that those kinds of traditions don't demand that they be founded in anything except for ancestral practice, right? So they are practiced because they are practiced, because the ancestors practiced them, right? And because of the other people around them practice them. But they are not founded in norms or beliefs, right? Whereas if you take, let's say, Bhikkhu Parekh's is the best articulated theory of culture. His theory would have you place any particular, let's say, traditional practice or cultural practice into a
belief framework
where you would have to look for its foundations, right? And that is something that Western contact with Asia has done, right? So when the West came to Asia, to India, for example, they asked the question, you guys are practicing all these things. What are the foundations for these practices? And then they looked to the texts. And then they said, these texts mean that, this is what provides meaning to the kind of practices that you're. But this was a very a Western way of going about reading a different culture, right? And it tells you more about the West than it tells you about the Indian culture. So as a consequence, they ended up founding all these religions like, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism. These are all constructs that the West produced. They're not Indian constructs as such, right? And I would argue they don't exist in India at all, right? They simply exist in Western universities. So today we are told that it's Hinduism which found these particular set of practices, but that's not true, right? They are simply practiced because they are traditional practices. And they're certainly not rivals to each other, right? So this claim that Hindus are rivals to Jains and Jains are rivals to Buddhists and so on. These are claims which are set up because of European colonialism, right? They don't exist in Indian culture.
So are you then saying that anthropology is just a construct like the other Western analysis of or creation of culture via reading texts? Is this what you say is the fallibility of anthropological notions of culture?
Well, to be honest, at one level, everything is a construct, right? Even Einstein's theories are a construct in that sense, right? Everything is scientific knowledge is a construct. But then you can test it. You can test particular, let's say, certain theoretical claims which are made within social sciences or natural sciences or whatever, and say, does it satisfy our criteria for knowledge? And if they don't, then we have the right to abandon them. That's all. But it's not because they are constructs, right? I don't think human beings can probably it's possible to claim that human beings can't do without constructs. We all function with constructs all the time. So the fallibility of anthropology, if it is fallible, doesn't lie in that.
Kitty, may I join you?
Yes, please, Feroz.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Adding to, I'm not at all addressing the issue of theories in what Prakash has been speaking about and what Janet has interrogated. But to add to this point that Prakash is making, which is we have to look beyond what is usually looked at and try, and when we are applying those theories, to see how we define the subject matter of the test. So, for example, we move from culture to the specific values in culture that we're going to look at. And in this, for example, now, which is what I add to Prakash's points, when UNESCO set up, established the World Heritage Site in Mauritius at the Pravasi Ghat, which was the very dock which Nilufer illustrated in her talk, the indentured laborers arriving at Port Louis. The UNESCO citation says of the Ghat, this sole surviving example of this unique modern diaspora represents not only the development of modern system of contractual labor, but also the memories, traditions, and values that these men, women, children carried with them when they left their countries of origin to work in foreign lands, and subsequently bequeathed to their millions of descendants, us, for whom the site holds great symbolic meaning. So, Prakash, when you're taking a look at culture, law, and literature, UNESCO was looking at memories, traditions, and values. I want to go and we looked at literature when Nilufer and Janet are speaking of such events. But I think what is happening in the last 100 years, and I'm speaking now only of Kenya, East Africa, but Kenya particularly, what is being impacted on Kenya's history is not indenture culture. It is the passenger culture, making the distinction which South Africa made between indentured immigrants and non-indentured immigrants who came voluntarily. And so there is a larger physical presence of the descendants of the passenger immigrants in Kenya and possibly elsewhere. And those are the business community in Kenya. And so what is culturally impacting is not the indentured culture, but the business culture in Kenya. And what is a business culture in Kenya? For those 100 years from, say, 1919, the end of the war, and further to now, there is a second parallel legal structure. It is and the specifics of that, Prakash, are, for example, the presence of oral bills of exchange. You simply ring up another person and say, in Gujarati, send over 2 trunks, be peti moklo. And the person being asked doesn't say, what security are you giving? When are you, what is my certainty that you will return the money, etc., etc. All that is not there. And he doesn't say, write to me about it. It's an oral exchange. There is no security asked for. All that he says is, when will you return it? 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is. So what we have here is money lending on a code which is nothing to do with the Bills of Exchange Act, nothing to do with the Law of Contract Act, nothing to do with banking practice. What is the rationale for this? It is you see that the critical issue is that the person who is borrowing and the person who is lending, competitors in the business world. This is the man across the road who's selling the same things through another duka. It may be a relative, it may not be a relative, but the rationale for this is not a profit for the person lending, not a simple banking exchange, a simple source of credit for the borrower. It is the principle that the presence of business is the rationale for which the whole whole community is committed. Because where there is business, the community's survival is ensured because it can absorb a hostile government, it can absorb a hostile immigration law, it can survive a set of laws where, for example, it was illegal to keep accounts in Kenya in Gujarati. It is a protection against the set political demands for the exclusion of the whole of the Indian community on the in the 1990 to 1923 period. It was the protection against Natal South African laws finally coming into force in Kenya, because it made the business community independent of whatever the government did. Could still survive, independent of the banks being leveraged, independent of the missions. No force, and that is why the Dukawala, with laws against them, actual laws and steps taken by the settlers to create parallel dukas and so on, they survived for these last 125 years because they have this separate code of laws amongst themselves. That is what is practically what diasporic culture means today in Kenya. Not the memories, traditions, and values of those who came under the indenture, as did my family. So when you are looking at this, and I'll give you a very practical example of this value. So when we were looking at what we are posing as the Asian African heritage in Kenya, we are trying to see what are the values that the indentured laborers brought over. And what we found instead was, how did we survive all this? And now the question is, have these values become Kenyan values? So, because we, never mind what India thinks, our political loyalty is not to India, although many of the Kenyan diaspora have a political loyalty very clearly to India and not to Kenya. But have these immigrant values transferred into national values? I can only give you an example of it. When difficult days arrived at the Dukawalas through all those years, 1920, 1906, and so on, where the first anti-Indian immigration law started, these cultural values, this second code of laws kept them through. Then came a national crisis in 1982. In 1982, there was an attempted coup in Kenya. The government was displaced for about 18, 20 hours. And during that period, the whole of central business was looted, every shop window was smashed, the streets became a paving of snow and glittering smithereens of these windows. Everything came to a standstill. The next day, everything came to a standstill. The third day, something was happening, and it was this. The business community, and here, Prakash, it was the Shah community, which made a critical decision. And the critical decision was this. Should they continue to retain their huge investment in Nairobi, Kenya, all over Kenya? Should they finance the restoration of Nairobi as a business capital? Because their withdrawal would generate withdrawal of other communities, Indian and or foreign Western investments. And it is the Shah elders, not Shah office holders in Oshwal things or not. These are elders, community elders, met amongst themselves and took a decision, yes, we'll remain. And by doing that, they were effectively loaning the capital of the entire community to Moi and to the Kenyan Treasury. Exactly what they do and did in all those years when individuals and sections of the community were needing capital. No security, no nothing in writing, oral request. And that value protected and ensured the survival of Kenya in this modern persona of being the capital of investment in Eastern Africa and the whole region. So culture is more than the ideas, how did they put it? The memories, traditions, and values of my family or others. We have moved into a completely different level. And this business business culture has been brought into the UK, but it's not holding any, it's not getting purchase in the US, because we have been closer to Britain and British life and British investment and the old accusation that the Indian community has a foot here and a foot there has given us a greater participation in British business life than in US business life. So this in it is what you're saying. Let's look at something more than simply the categories that the West has been looking at. And truly, you will not find written records of this business culture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Feroz Navroti, for contributing this very specific and illustrative example of how culture expands as a concept. Do you want to have a word back at this, Prakash, or should we just go on?
No, just to say, I appreciate the comments very much, and I don't know if there was a hint, but if there was a hint, I agree with the hint, which is that it needs some kind of researcher's attention. How all this flowering of let's say a set of business traditions, right? How they got transplanted into the Kenyan or the East African space, and how they grew. And yet we don't seem to have a grasp of how this has happened. And I completely agree with that. I have one eye to this part of the world, because my family decided to leave Kenya exactly after the 1982 coup. So I'm a kind of transplant into Britain as a consequence of that event. But I wasn't aware of the decisions that the elders took at that time. That's new information for me. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, we have one question from Professor Sushila Gopal from Mauritius. She's asking, when we are talking about national and political citizenship, would you say that it is still citizenship for the individual and not for the group?
Is that a question for Janet? Because citizenship figured in her talk?
Yes.
Is it for Janet?
She is not mentioned. If Professor Sushila, if you are, I don't see her online as well. Yeah.
She is online.
Yeah, she is. She is.
Here she is.
Yeah.
So national and political citizenship for the individual or the group?
Yes.
My understanding is that the individual can speak for a group and vice versa, that it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. It is about the perception of the individual within the nation's space, possibly. And if you wish to take a political position, that can be either individual or within a group. The work I've been doing is mainly on citizen activism, and that usually is group citizen acts of resistance to national or unpalatable decisions about belonging and exclusion. So I think that these are fluid concepts between individuals and groups, but they could also be, they can be distanced from each other as well. I'm not sure that I've answered the question very well, but that's how I see it.
Thank you, Janet. Looking at our time, we're almost ready to wrap up here. I have just this remark perhaps to add, Prakash, about culture and the law. At the end, of course, you are right that however definitive conceptualization or definition of culture can be, we need it, or you need it if the law and culture are to relate to each other. This is not possible otherwise, because the reaction you otherwise get is, for example, a colleague of mine in the program here in Münster, Thomas Gutmann, who holds the chair of philosophy of law here in Münster, wrote a very stiff treatise published in 2015, where he tried to answer the question, what can culture contribute to the law? His very short and pithy answer was nothing but murkiness. And the answer, I don't think is meant. It comes precisely from this point that culture itself it seems to be a murky concept. So if culture is to be related to other, let's say, discourses or disciplines, one needs this kind of clarification, even if it's only a clarification for a time. And perhaps one way forward to reaching that kind of clarification of what we think culture is could be exactly in this way of juxtaposing it or bringing it into dialogue with other disciplines or concepts like law. I think the law-culture dialogue is actually a possibility for both sides to clarify what the concepts stand for. I don't have a ready-made clarification for that. I can only say that literature seems to have been doing better than culture as a partner to discussing law. In 2000, there was this fairly comprehensive compendium by Robert Weisberg on law and literature, and the upshot was that the future of law and literature is law and culture. That happened for a while, but it didn't really hold the promises that it had. And law and literature is coming back as a really disciplinary conversation between two disciplines which are fairly well defined. I'm sticking my head out when I say this about literature, but comparatively speaking, literature today, it wasn't always like that, seems to be better defined than the concept of culture. So I think that the move you are advocating towards clarifying what we think culture is needs to be there. And even if we don't succeed, the trying perhaps is worth it on the way. Maybe the way, as they say, is the aim. the journey is what we are reaching for.
The destiny.
So
Professor Baruja wants to make a point, I guess.
And Janet Wilson.
Yes, and Professor Wilson.
And then I think we have to wrap up.
Then we'll wrap up. No, I was just going to support what Klaus has been saying. And I think we need to engage more with the views expressed by Prakash today. And we would really like it if we were able to organize something along those lines in the near future as well. And maybe have another webinar with a different group of participants, with Prakash definitely being in it. And we can take this engagement further of culture and law and all that we have been looking. And of course, provided Prakash is able to give us the time. And I'm sure Rajeshri would also agree with that. I don't know what Klaus thinks.
Yes, why not?
And Janet wants to say something.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think there's room for a much bigger discussion here. And I think Prakash has opened up a big field that really is quite challenging. And I guess I'm still sort of brooding about what he said, and I want to ask him about this view that culture can be seen as a production of knowledge, as to whether this is in any sense in conflict with the view that you seem to be skeptical about, that culture could be about belief, because the idea of belief is to do with a sort of a sense of the sui generis, but the production of knowledge is about the, reaching into the unknown, which seems to, be almost, for some ways of looking at it, a challenge to belief. So, do you see these two as being compatible in any way, or as being able to be in dialogue, or what is the connection there? I mean, I like the idea that it's a production of knowledge. That seems to me it's got some conviction, but I don't know if it really covers the territory, to be honest.
Just 3 quick points. Yes, I'd be happy to involve in a future discussion, because I think much more needs to be said. I completely agree. Second thing was in response to Janet's question. I think culture being about knowledge is an entailment of the theoretical framework that I'm trying to outline.
Okay.
So knowledge would definitely have something to do with it, right? Because cultures require knowledge in order to make their habitats. Without that, they couldn't do that. But at the same time, the larger theorization of culture should be able to explain why some cultures put an emphasis on beliefs like the Western culture. And not only that, but it tends to read the existence of, it tends to accentuate the importance of beliefs for other cultures as well in ways which are unwarranted. So we'd have to explain both movements in the same move, as it were. And I think that larger theorization of culture can do that. You know, it'd be quite interesting to do that. And there's a bigger discussion to be had about that. I find that really interesting. The third point is what I couldn't really talk about today is what I wanted to is what happens when there's this collision, right? I mean, we talked about the language rights and so on, you know, because colonialism is one such encounter between cultures, right? But the diasporic situation is also an encounter between cultures. And so what happens as a consequence of that? Firozji described what happened to the Indians in East Africa in some way, right? So that's one element of that contact, right? Now, how should we theorize what's happened there? And is the contact between Indian and Western societies in the diaspora here different to that, right? So is the East African experience different to the Western experience, and why is it different, right? And I think we can talk about that in cultural terms as well.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I agree. I think it would be wonderful to have more time to tease out some of these points that you're making, and perhaps to look at other examples as well as the Kenyan one and Nilufer's one. Yeah. So I really sincerely hope that we can have another session like this. Yeah.
We'll do it.
And Nilufer, madam, as rightly you pointed out, we will take it ahead and organize few more programs on this lecture series on diaspora.
We'll do that.
Yeah. It was a wonderful session by everyone, really.
I think Klaus wants to wind up. So.
Yes, I think for me as the chair, it is my thing to do now to say thank you again to the three speakers, but also to everyone who has contributed in the Q&A section. I think we've had an interesting and lively talk. And the best, I think, roundup and summary of a talk like this and a meeting like this is that a lot of people agree we need to have more talks like this on topics related. I thank Professor Varadi that she is able and willing to take this up even in Mumbai itself, which we'd be very pleased to do and continue to collaborate.